I'm Timmy Davis. I've founded this little clinic. I want to tell you a little bit about it, then we'll jump in. So first of all, thank you all for coming to the launch of the Psychedelic Experience Clinic. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping, then I'll say a few words about the clinic itself, and then hand the floor to our wonderful speakers. We'll briefly hear from Ian Roulier on behalf of his organisation SciPan, followed by Jeffrey Gus, MD of NYU and Fluence, Jules Evans of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, and Professor Richard Boothby from Loyola University. I'm so grateful for them joining us tonight, but I can only apologise for the lack of diversity in presenters this evening. Representation is an important issue, and that's on me. Please notice that the meeting is being recorded, and I will upload it soon after the event. So keep yourselves muted throughout, and then your faux pas won't be immortalised online for all to see. There will be time for you to ask questions, both of myself and each speaker after they've presented, but I'll have to keep this relatively brief so that each has adequate time for their presentation. So if you have a question, please write it in the chat and I'll do my best. I'm sorry if we don't get to yours, but I will do my best. If you'd like to hear about future events, please do subscribe to the newsletter using the link, which I'll pop in the chat. And please also consider sharing that link to your website or with your circles. We need to spread the word about the existence of the clinic so that we can reach the members of the public who might benefit from the service that we're offering. One final thing. The clinic is set up and run on a very, very low budget, covering the minimum expenses of the website and the group supervision. We hope to achieve all that we will need through ticket sales to regular events like this and through donations. I'm very grateful for your purchase of tickets and your donations made so far. We've made a dent in the costs of running for the first year and hope that we won't have to change the income model and charge membership fees to therapists who graciously give their time to the public in the form of low-cost therapy spaces. Thank you for donating to the establishment of the clinic. Now, I'm going to share these slides that you can already see running and give a brief introduction to the clinic. The info on the slides doesn't correspond directly to what I'm going to say, so hopefully the two in combination will elucidate what the clinic is trying to do and why. So without further ado, let's get into it. You might have heard the old joke, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer, only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Things are a little different these days. When we ask how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb, the excesses of pro-psychedelic discourse might implore us to respond with none. The light bulb just has to take magic mushrooms. This would be a great thing if it were true, but rarely is anything so straightforward, especially at the intersection of the body, the mind, and society, the place where both psychopathology and its treatment take place. In the 1950s, thorazine, the first antipsychotic, and other breakthroughs in pharmacology brought hope to psychiatry, which at the time was frustrating to both patients and practitioners. Biological psychiatry's increasing focus on drugs and the body replaced psychoanalysis and its focus upon the mind as the dominant model of treating mental illness. The psychedelics, particularly LSD, appeared at this time and looked to be very useful medicines in the treatment of otherwise intractable pathologies like alcoholism. After decades of suppression, psychedelics are being researched again, often as if they are simply drug treatments that facilitate cathartic abreactions of disturbing experiences. This way of understanding how they work is similar to how Freud initially thought traumatic hysteria should be treated. This is until he invented the psychoanalytic technique of free association and the talking cure, which he deemed ethically and effectively superior. But when Western psychiatrists first encountered psychedelics, they were steeped in psychoanalytic theory, and a simple biological model was not enough to account for the myriad fantastic experiences produced under the effects of these powerful substances. Torsten Passie's work shows that there were many more psychiatrists practicing psycholytic psychotherapy, where lower doses of psychedelics were used to augment psychoanalytic process than were using them as a single high-dose one-hit wonder. Wherever psychoanalysis and psychedelics came into contact, There were psychiatrists who saw them as synergistic. For example, a very recent paper by Rodolfo Oliveri shows that in post-war Argentina, psychoanalytically trained psychiatrists were also using psychedelics to facilitate the psychoanalytic process of exploring the unconscious. And here I just want to make a bit of an academic point. Exploring the unconscious does not, to me, mean roaming around the landscape of some hidden place or location, but should instead be understood as allowing the patient to have an elaborate cognitive and emotional experience that can then be brought into the session for analysis, much like a dream. Freud, of course, said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. The psychoanalytic practice of interpreting dreams can reveal unacceptable sexual and aggressive desires and dissociated experiences which the patient would rather not admit into consciousness and acknowledge. The patient, of course, wants to resist these experiences. They forget them or deny their symbolism, attacking the links between them. Even when resisted, it can often be the case that the revelation of newly uncovered unconscious material can cause trouble in the life of the patient as they struggle to come to terms with the new perspectives on their life and their self. In the face of this destabilization, the analyst remains with the patient, continuing to facilitate the working through of the revelations, providing a non-judgmental space outside of the normal laws of societal nicety, where anything, no matter how distasteful or disturbing, can be expressed and thought about in the total confidentiality of the psychoanalytic container. This kind of work is the bread and butter of psychoanalysis, and we know from the experience of millions of analysts and patients, often the same people, as each analyst must also have the experience of being a patient, that this work is not easy, nor is it quick. The work can be destabilizing for periods of time, aiming as it does at truth and transformation rather than the provision of easy answers, advice, succor, or comfort. As we will learn from our speakers, psychedelic experiences seem to share this with psychoanalysis. Psychedelic experience is not simply a way to fast forward a linear healing process, claims of an inner healing intelligence or holotropic telos of the mind notwithstanding. As my friend and colleague Tassin Noorani has put it, psychedelics partake in the archetype of the pharmacon. They are both poison and cure. They can lead to new and surprising answers, but at the same time, they can open up many more questions. In other words, the action of psychedelics should not be understood as a simple addition of something good and healing, or as Freud would put it, to work per via pore, but neither should they be understood as working only per via levare, that is, working by subtracting something bad from the psyche, like a trauma, for example, and nor should psychoanalysis. Psychedelic experience and psychoanalysis do take away, but something is always added in the process too. Both psychedelic experience and the psychoanalytic process work by limiting the censorship of the conscious ego, lifting repression, and allowing what Lawrence Fishman, following Winnicott, calls the emergence of not me experience. In the language of modern neuroscience, the patient's higher level priors or beliefs that keep them locked in repetitive patterns of behavior are loosened, paused, or removed for a brief period of time under the influence of psychedelics. This allows for new ways of thinking and experiencing the world which were otherwise simply unimaginable. While our previous beliefs and our critical factor are suspended, new beliefs and ways of being can be entertained. This has obvious therapeutic utility, but it is also here that one risk comes with the use of psychedelics becomes apparent. There is a very real possibility of being influenced in the direction of the beliefs of those powerful others or groups in which one is embedded before, during, and after the experience. Psychoanalysis is founded on an acknowledgement of the risk of domination of the patient by the doctor, thereby giving it rare analytical and ethical power in thinking about the process and the results of psychedelic experience. Sometimes the beliefs that are suspended or lifted during psychedelic experiences can be so fundamental that the ensuing experience can shake our very grounding in reality to its foundations, producing what is known as ontological shock. While such an experience is also possible as a result of psychoanalysis, it is very rare. But as mentioned before, revelations that feel very true can have a similarly destabilizing impact and can and do occur with relative frequency in analysis. Psychedelics can confront the one who takes them with experiences that feel so real and true that all other experiences, ways of understanding the world and being in it, must make way to accommodate this new experience, this new truth. For example, an experience of the interconnectedness of all life, an extreme empathy with and participation in all things may be incompatible with a lifetime of habitual self-centeredness. This insight is not going away. It's not going to budge, feeling as it does as if it were a fundamental truth about reality. And so it is the patient's conduct and understanding of life that must change, and all other beliefs must now shift to accommodate this experience. Importantly, this takes time. Aberrant and novel experiences create disruption. Some would say they need to be integrated. And some of you may have noticed that I've not used the word integration anywhere on the website or on social media to describe what we are offering at the clinic. For those that don't know, integration is the word typically used to talk about support after a psychedelic experience. Instead, if I had to talk about what it is we set out to do in this work, it would be a kind of psychedelic working through, where not all experiences are integrated as if they had intrinsic value and truth, but are instead analyzed in order to be understood, an exploration in relationship, not an explanation by an expert. This is an important distinction, especially in the context of what are known as recovered memories. Questionable half memories, half fantasies that cannot be made sense of, and that can undermine someone's faith in their own mind. Again, these are clinical phenomena relevant to the history of psychoanalysis and to the contemporary psychedelic clinic. It's a very real phenomena that I've encountered in patients. To speak of psychedelics in this critical way is not to deny the evidence emerging from clinical trials and other research that they are extremely physiologically safe and can be used to facilitate psychotherapy. We're right at the beginning of these substances entering back into the mainstream treatment paradigms of the Western world, and despite the understanding of indigenous cultures who have used these substances for generations, we are yet to truly understand them in our own terms using our own analytic tools. As I've often said before, as the cumulative sample size of participants on clinical trials increases, and as more people get access to these substances, so will the amount of weirdness reported increase. There have been reports of experiences of alien beings, of telepathy, religious experiences, angels, demons, and much more. The number is increasing, and the models of the mind and of therapy in popular discourse, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, are dominated by a fetishization of measurability, quantification, and objectivity, which simply fails to say anything about these experiences and their subjective import, as well as anything about how they should be handled by therapists within the transference. It's for this reason that I believe this clinic is needed. Psychoanalysis is a rigorous approach, philosophically grounded and engaged, accounting for phenomenology, political discourse, and subjective variability. Freud intended psychoanalysis to be three things: an investigative method, a body of knowledge, and a therapy. This clinic intends to use this method, albeit updated according to the progress of the field in the past century, to build on and augment the contemporary body of psychoanalytic knowledge, and to provide therapy to those who may be seeking it following psychedelic experiences. Psychoanalysis and psychotherapy should not be the exclusive pursuit of the wealthy, and that is why the clinic offers a low-cost referral service. Events like this one allow us to gain the funds required to provide the 4 trainee psychotherapists with group supervision within which to explore the phenomena that arise with experienced analysts. Beyond the low-cost clinical referral service, the Psychedelic Experience Clinic hopes to bring contemporary psychoanalysis and psychedelic research into conversation in order to provide the best possible service to those who are looking to make better use of their experiences to understand themselves and their lives, gaining greater freedom and fulfillment for themselves both now and in the future. But that's enough for me now. But before I hand over to Ian, I would just like to thank a few people for their help in the establishment of the clinic. First of all of you lovely people for coming to this event, and for those who have donated to the clinic. I also want to thank Jack Versace and Felipe Zar for helping me to think about how best to collect the data to justify the intervention and enable us to contribute to the scientific literature on psychedelics. I would also like to thank the fantastically creative and kind Hannah Gander for her pro bono design work, including the hand-drawn rabbit for the logo. Ultimately, I would like to thank, my colleagues at the Centre for Evidence-Based Drug Policy and the PAR campaign, my friends and my family for supporting me while I put this together. And of course, thanks to the therapists who've given their time to providing the low-cost slots and the speakers who I'm going to hand over to now. So first of all, we're going to have Ian Roulier of Saipan. I'll just read a little bit from his bio. Ian is the co-founder of the Psychedelic Participant Advocacy Network, Saipan, and an expert by experience, having taken part in 2 trials examining the effects of psilocybin on treatment-resistant depression at Imperial College and King's College London. He has spoken at the European Parliament, European Medicines Agency, and at various events and conferences. Ian is also an ASA integration sharing circle facilitator and a participant representative for the King's College Cider Trial Steering Group. He co-founded Saipan with Leonie Schneider, who unfortunately can't join us this evening, in 2021 to help amplify and represent participant voices, to help safeguard future participants receiving psychedelic-assisted therapy, and to establish peer support spaces post-treatment. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Ian now.
Thank you, Timmy. Just want to say, first of all, that I'm delighted to join you this evening to help launch this fantastic organisation. It really is much needed. So as Saipan is a network of people who've received psychedelic assisted therapy via clinical trials and treatments, I'd like to start by focusing a little on the journey of the clinical trial participant, and I'll begin with my own story. So when the Imperial College Psilocybin for Depression pilot study ended back in 2015, my depression had lifted and I was lucky enough to experience an afterglow for a few months afterwards. But as I felt the grip of my depression returning, I found myself grasping, increasingly desperate for some way to stop myself sliding back to the darkness and stuckness that I'd experienced for so many years before the trial. I regularly emailed the team who'd supported me throughout the trial, and they were as helpful and supportive as they could possibly be, but they weren't allowed to offer me ongoing therapy or another dose, which is what I ideally wanted. And back then, there were no integration groups to help me navigate those increasingly rough waters. Now, my experience is not unique. People who've received psychedelic-assisted therapy via clinical trials often feel abandoned and isolated once the trial ends. And then they begin searching for ways to continue integrating and making sense of their experiences, regardless of whether they were profound, challenging, or, as is often the case, a deep, rich, sometimes confusing mixture. I'm happy to say that now there are various support structures in place for people that they are signposted to following their treatment, including integration groups and peer support groups. And Saipan are looking to launch their own peer support group in the coming weeks as well. I mean, as you'll no doubt be aware already, there is increasing talk about removing the therapeutic element from psychedelic-assisted therapy to ensure people are safe during and after dosing and to gain the fullest possible benefits of the treatment. People need therapy and support. We would argue that removing it is dangerous. The cost and scalability of these treatments is important, but removing therapy will greatly affect people's treatment outcomes and their potential recovery. At worst, it could even derail the whole sector if people's well-being is overlooked for the sake of profit. There are also difficulties from a regulatory perspective. The FDA and European Medicines Agency saying that they do not and cannot regulate the therapeutic component of these treatments, forming a barrier for psychedelic-assisted therapy to receive the approval it needs to become legally available. So I think there needs to be some intelligent thought and genuine will across the whole sector to overcome these hurdles in an ethical and safe way. As an organisation, Saipan is pushing back as much as we possibly can against any diminishing of the therapeutic component of these treatments. we're heartened that there are some organisations that do recognise the need for prolonged support following clinical trials. So yeah, so we've received funding for our peer support program that we're launching soon. Just 20 people. It's a pilot, but Beckley SciTech have provided that funding. They understand the need for ongoing treatment and support, and there are other organisations out there as well who are looking to include peer support elements within their trial and treatment models. In an ideal world, the whole sector would view taking care of people's long-term support needs as part of their duty of care. And this is something we're also pushing for. But if the therapeutic element is reduced to ensure these treatments can become widely available, this creates an even greater need for support via an organisation like the Psychedelic Experience Clinic. Many people have reached out to Saipan post-treatment to find out which paths they can pursue next to continue their integration, connect with other people who've had similar experiences, or simply to find support. Peer support and integration groups do provide essential help for many people, whether they've experienced psychedelics via a clinical trial, during a group ceremony or retreat, or in a less formal setting. But there are those who need a greater level of therapeutic support. And again, this is where the Psychedelic Experience Clinic, I believe, will play a vital role. To be able to speak to a psychedelic-informed psychotherapist, where that foundation of understanding is already in place, and within a completely supportive and non-judgmental environment, is hugely valuable, and still, it's an all too rare opportunity for many people who desperately need it. We need an ecosystem of support in place, and it's been heartening to see one being built since my first trial experiences almost a decade ago. There are now several groups like the Maudsley Psychedelic Society Integration Group and Jules Evans Online Support Group for people to turn to after a psychedelic experience. There are much needed communities like ASA Integration, which Timmy mentioned earlier, education and support organisations like PsyAware, and as I've mentioned already, Saipan also looking to bring people together and provide peer support as well. That's specifically for clinical trial participants. I think when there are people who are struggling so much that a non-therapeutic peer support space is not suitable or adequate for them, and for who being directed back to overstretched NHS services may provide little support, we will hopefully be able to instead direct people to the Psychedelic Experience Clinic, where they can receive proper therapeutic assistance, which is fully tailored for their needs. And hopefully it works the other way as well. Any former clinical trial or treatment participants who've received support via the clinic and are well enough again to take part in peer support groups will hopefully be able to join our peer support community or the others that I mentioned. So working in this connected mycelial way and pooling skills, wisdom and experience and insight, I think is the key to creating the ecosystem that's required to provide the support that's needed by so many people. The fact that the Psychedelic Experience Clinic will be subsidised and therefore accessible and affordable is also extremely important when you consider that the ability to earn of people living with chronic health conditions or struggling to cope is often greatly diminished. As a growing number of people have psychedelic experiences in a variety of settings, there's an increasing need for options and choices that support people with sense making and integration and on a therapeutic level. The Psychedelic Experience Clinic will provide another key pillar of this support and help ensure that people don't need to feel isolated or alone after a psychedelic experience. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions at all, I don't know how long I've got, Timmy, or if that's time up or not, but
I haven't had any in the chat.
okay.
Maybe we'll give people an opportunity, and if some come up, address
Yeah,
to you,
I'll
then
be here for the whole event. So yeah, thanks everyone. And thank you, Timmy, for this initiative.
thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for coming. Okay, in that case, we'll pass over to Jeff if you're ready. I'll just give you a brief introduction. Um, Jeffrey Gus, MD, is a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, researcher, and teacher with an interest in the integration of psychoanalytic therapy and psychedelic therapy. He is on the faculty of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and is a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at NYU School of Medicine. Dr. Gus was the co-principal investigator and director of psychedelic therapy training for the NYU study on psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in the treatment of cancer-related anxiety, and is a study therapist with numerous clinical trials of psychedelic therapy. He recently published a psychoanalytic perspective on psychedelic experience in the most recent issue of Psychoanalytic Dialogues, which I have to say is a fantastic paper, and I encourage everybody to go read it. He maintains a private practice of psychotherapy and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in New York City. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and to hear so much speech that I completely agree with. It feels like a losing battle to not only keep therapy, but to keep talking to patients, no matter whether you're called a guide or a facilitator, to keep the human element in the core processes around psychedelic therapy. It's getting more and more important that each of us speak up loud and long. But I'm going to move over now to my prepared talk for today, which is a case of from the research project that I was involved in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And I'm going to go back so far because as a person who is somewhat prominent in the psychedelic and psychoanalytic community, I don't do psychedelic therapy with my analytic patients. I do ketamine-assisted therapy, and that's very much a part of my practice. But I'm going to present a case today, not of psychoanalytic therapy using psychedelics, but a patient who was in our trial who had a psychoanalyst as his therapist. So like it or not, he was in psychoanalytically oriented psychedelic therapy with me. I'm going to present a case that is not typical because it had such a beautiful and satisfying outcome, but I think it shows so beautifully what psychoanalysts can offer and can learn from psychedelic therapy. Now, the most anxiety-provoking part for me, trying to get my tech to work correctly. Okay, did I arrive? Are you seeing the landing page and nothing else?
Looks good. Looks good.
All right. Good. So today I'm going to offer a clinical case with a bit of introductory material. The center part of the talk today will be the description of a treatment that one young man received as a participant in the NYU study entitled Psilocybin-Assisted Therapy for Cancer-Related Existential Distress. The study ran from 2008 to 2015, and the young man I'm going to present, the soccer player, was in the study in 2013. There's two parts of today's talk. The first is a brief description of the structure of the NYU cancer-related anxiety study, and then the case presentation will follow. Okay, so this was a randomized clinical trial. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study. This means that both the researchers and the therapists and the participants, none of them knew which arm they were in of the research, or that is what they received first, either niacin or psilocybin. So ideally, everybody in the study was blind to the substance that was being received. And this itself creates an almost unsurmountable problem in psychedelic research, but that's a story for another talk. This was a crossover study, meaning that each participant had two dosing sessions, one with active drug and one with placebo. Tony Bossis and Steve Ross were my co-investigators here, or Steve was the principal investigator, and Tony and I were co-PIs. Gabby Eganligibus, Crystalia Colionci, Alex Belser, Tara Malone, and John Rosen, and many others were part of this study. And it was very early in this the psychedelic, so-called psychedelic renaissance. And in a way, it benefited from there being a lack of intense structuring that subsequent studies showed. And we were able to do really whatever we thought best in the dosing sessions and in the integration sessions. And each person that was a study therapist was able to bring their own particular way of working, a way of understanding, and relationship with psychedelic therapy, into the room. And psychedelic therapy research has gotten much more manualized after this, and in many ways is the worse for that. So in 2016, we published this paper, which is a data-driven paper showing not changes in existential distress, which was the title of the study, but by the time it came to be published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, the paper was called Rapid and Sustained Symptom Reduction following psilocybin treatment for anxiety and depression. So in order to manicure this study for its publishability and for its acceptability, the model of a psychopharmacological agent to rapidly reduce symptoms was brought about rather than transformation of meaning and so forth. But even so, that's what happened in this study for many people, and in particular the participant that we're going to talk about now. So the overall length of the study from the very left to the right of the yellow arrow was 9 months. There were 2 dosing sessions, one with niacin and the other with psilocybin. And in the next 7 weeks later, in the next dosing session, they had the reverse. So by the end, everybody had received 1 dose of placebo and 1 dose of active drug. There were 4 weeks at the beginning, during which we had 3 preparatory sessions. And I'm not going to go into detail at all about these, but these were really quite interesting. And we did a lot of work to figure out how to use these preparatory sessions in ways that built the therapeutic alliance, that helped us get to know the participant well and prepare them for the experience that they were going to have. So in between dosing 1 and dosing 2, there were 7 weeks, during which there were 3 integration sessions. Dosing session 2 was followed by 4 more weeks of active treatment, during which there were 3 integration sessions and termination with the therapists. So it was only this period of time that they were actually in therapy with psychedelic therapists, but from here to here, they were participants in the study. And during these last 4 months, there was a lot of questionnaires and symptom measurements and other things about the mystical state and so forth that have generated a lot of really interesting research. Again, this is a quantitative study that we published. My colleagues Alex Belser, Gabby Egan-Liebes, and Cody Swift wrote 2 papers, 2 quantitative studies following detailed inquiry and all of the technical ways that that qualitative study is done seriously. The first, the patient experiences of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, and the second, cancer at the dinner table. So this paper, these came from the same study, but they separated it out into 2 different papers, one about the experience of psilocybin and the other about the experience with cancer. And with that, I'm going to turn to the case presentation, a young man's relationship with his cancer body. The participant I'm going to refer to as Robert. When Robert came to our study, he was 22 years old. He was suffering from daily panic attacks, severe daily anxiety, and a massively distorted body image. These symptoms had been plaguing him since his recovery from a life-threatening acute T-cell leukemia that occurred to him when he was 17 years of age, 5 years prior coming to our study. He was in his senior year of high school. When Robert came to see us, he presented as a healthy-looking young man. He'd been released from cancer treatment, from oncology treatment, and declared cancer-free for a full 3 years. He was bright and articulate, and he spoke in a rather matter-of-fact way about himself, and would probably, be described as having an obsessional style of relating. He was very good in talking about the details and specific experiences, quite articulate in the way that he spoke. But in addition to this, in a rather calm way, he told us really a story of post-traumatic stress disorder following his cancer and his cancer treatment. You can't really be diagnosed with PTSD from a cancer treatment because it's too common. It's too much a part of everyday life. And PTSD requires that the traumatic event be something outside ordinary life. And a medical illness, no matter how serious, doesn't qualify, which I think is a problem in our diagnostic way of thinking about things, because this was certainly a massively traumatic experience. And he had many symptoms of PTSD relating to his cancer illness and treatment, and we're going to talk about those. He was very expressive of his anxiety and his traumatized body image and an insistent preoccupation with death. These symptoms persisted long after his cancer treatment was completed and he had been declared healthy. When we first met him, he was finishing an undergraduate degree, majoring in anthropology. He had a girlfriend, and he was working on applications to graduate schools. Although he had had a full recovery from the oncologist's point of view, he experienced his body as cadaverous, weak, unreliable, and sickly, just as he did during the worst part of his chemotherapy. Robert grew up in a large religious family, deeply observant of their Congregational Methodist Church. He had regular home prayer and Bible study 2 or 3 times a week, and these were a central part of his family life and a central part of his spiritual life. He was homeschooled by his mother up to the 8th grade. He grew up with a profound, deep faith in God and religion and the power of prayer. He expressed having a personal relationship with Christ, and his faith and the feeling of faith in him was central to his sense of security and safety in the world. He carried this personal relationship with Christ with him as he entered his cancer treatment. As a child and as a teen, Robert was very extroverted, and after switching to public school at grade 9, he was socially popular, successful in sports, popular with girls, dated a lot, gregarious, and he described himself as feeling invincible. He loved athletics, school, food, alcohol, coke, smoking pot, dating girls, and he was an admired athlete in high school. However, his faith was shattered by his cancer and the 8 months of chemotherapy that it demanded. He was forced to forfeit his athletic scholarship to college and became very, very sick very fast. He could not feed himself or bathe himself or toilet himself. He was constantly nauseous and miserable. His mother became his primary caregiver, and he prayed and prayed to God for healing and for relief from his suffering, both from the cancer and from the chemotherapy. Robert experienced these prayers as going unanswered, and this led to his losing faith in God, in Christ, and in religion. He experienced intense anger with the church, with Christ, and with his parents. He felt that only Western medicine had done anything to help him or to relieve his suffering. Chemotherapy and anti-nausea medication helped him. The doctors and nurses, he felt, saved his life. When he reached out to Christ for help with nausea, with chemotherapy, he experienced that Christ had forsaken him. He lost all spiritual feeling, all feelings of faith, which for him were a profoundly sustaining part of his life. And the loss of this belief in him was devastating to him and made him change from being a religious and spiritual person to someone he described as a person devoted to allopathic materialism in understanding the world. So here are a few images that I put here to enjoy. On the top is just a little artwork from seeds and cinnamon sticks and so forth that we had in the study room. That's how the study capsules appeared. Below, we have Mary Cosimano and an unknown co-therapist with a model who is showing what the treatment room at Johns Hopkins looked like. That's another model below. And on the left is the NYU center where we did our work with participants in the study. So he took the medicine at about 8:30 in the morning, and he was very quiet. And an hour into the journey, an entity appeared to him. Now, as I mentioned, Robert is an obsessional and largely obedient person in terms of if you ask him to do something, he really wants to do it. It means a lot to him to be seen as a compliant person in the system that he's working in. And he wrote extensive notes the day after his session. So much of what I'm going to quote as if having said is what he wrote about his journey the night after it. So there's a lot of quotes that I'm going to say that he didn't say to us necessarily in session, but that were verbatim from what he'd written himself. So about an hour into the journey, an entity appeared to Robert, and the entity said, "I have come to guide you. I have come to show you what the medicine can do for you." The entity told Robert that he was not going to be allowed to see God, but that the entity was bringing information from God to him. The entity repeated, "I will be at your side as your guide through your journey, and I am going to show you what the medicine can do." The entity first brought him to his own funeral. This, witnessing your own funeral or a near-death experience, is not uncommon in psilocybin experiences. I mean, it's not uncommon with serotonergic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and ayahuasca. In fact, his psychedelic therapy did just that. In the study, there were common elements of a life review, the way that many at the end of their life review their life, looking back at their life from the perspective of being near death. And this often brings an interest in origin stories. Where did I come from? Where did we come from? And in Western and contemporary psychedelic use, this origin story usually means the family of origin, which begins in childhood. Many indigenous cultures and Westerners have a vision not just of where I came from in my family, but also many, many levels of origin experience, where our universe came from, where our planet came from, where the Earth came from, and the long sort of legacy of ancestors from which we have inherited. But a life review happened for many people in our study, and this can be harrowing for some, but it was revelatory for Robert. So this is Robert's voice. "I traveled a very, very long time to get to my funeral. Everything there was dead and had been dead for a long time. I mean, I wasn't there in my body. I was just there in my soul or my spirit or something like that. I wasn't there in my body. It was like a desert, and it was dry and brown, and there were melted clocks like in Salvador Dali painting. I mean, I don't remember having any feelings there. But I knew I just had to keep traveling. I just had to keep moving, but I felt nothing. I felt numb. I was in a vast desert that I was traveling through, and there were skulls all around it, and they were black and they were burned, and I could smell them. I traveled really, really far. It took forever to get through this desert. It seemed like forever. But I kept traveling, I kept moving forward. And then, very abruptly, he experienced himself being shot out of the top of the Empire State Building, and parts of his psyche and parts of his body spewing out over Manhattan. And after this very exhilarating and, kind of suggestive imagery, he landed safely in the foyer of Grand Central Terminal in New York City. And I have to say how much I love how New Yorky his story was. But there he was in the foyer of Grand Central Terminal. and there was an elegant party going on. And at this elegant party, everyone was dancing. Everybody was wearing tuxedos or evening gowns. Robert and his girlfriend were there, and they were dancing together, but they had a hard time staying together. They had a hard time keeping track of each other, losing each other. And they spent a good deal of time looking for each other, losing each other, finding each other, not being able to make eye contact, and then losing each other again. His mother and father were at the Grand Central Party also. They were dancing together a little ways away from Robert and his girlfriend, and it was easy for Robert to make eye contact with them and keep eye contact with them. They didn't speak to each other, but there was more of a sense of connection and stability or solidity to the connection than with the girlfriend. So this Grand Central elegant party went on for some time, and then suddenly it ended. And he describes being shot all alone into outer space in a kind of spaceship. He looked around and he thought, I'm all alone. I am all alone out here in spirit. I don't have a body. I'm all alone. I'm so alone. And yet I felt secure. I felt somehow like I was being held, like I was safe, even though I was alone. And then I began to sense that my mom and my dad and my brothers, my sister, my grandparents, my college roommates, somehow I could feel their presence with me out there in outer space. They were all there, but they weren't in their bodies either. They were the spirits that lived in the stars. He said the spirits in the sky were spirits of people who had loved me and cared for me and helped me grow up. I'm quoting him, I felt their love in the starshine. Every star felt like someone who had loved me. Then the entity came again and reminded him yet again that he was not going to be allowed to meet God. The entity said, though, that he had a message from God, and it is the secret of life that is being imparted to him by the entity. That secret of life, be kind to people. That's it. Be kind to people. Be nice to people. After this, Robert returned to the earth. He arrived at a forest and he walked through it and he climbed a mountain. But again, he said, I couldn't see the mountain. I felt it. I still didn't have a body. I felt myself climbing. I don't have a body, but I'm having to keep moving. It was just my mind that was there. I had no body. The entity said, I am here and you have to go on a journey. Robert said, I can't go on a journey. I don't have a body. I need a body if I'm going to go on a journey. The entity said, well, then we'll just have to go shopping for a body. And after that, after the entity said that, Robert saw a rack like the kind they have in department stores. And he thought, okay, I guess we're in a department store because it's time to shop. And here we are shopping. We're shopping for a body. So I went over to the rack, but it was practically empty. I went to the rack and I realized there was only one body there. It was obvious to me. There was only one body there. So I picked it. I had no choice. It was mine. It was my body. It was the only choice I had. So I picked it. I didn't have a choice. I put it on. I took the body that was there and I put it on. I needed a body. I got one. And so I took one. Suddenly, when he did this, the scene exploded in colors and lights, and he felt an immense sense of joy and relief. Robert told us during his integration session that once I found my body, everything changed. Things exploded in bright colors, and everything which was moving so slowly before in a kind of a disembodied way started moving much faster, and I had a lot of sensation in my body. The first thought I had after getting this body was about my mom and my dad having sex in order to create me. I thought about the sperm and the egg coming together to create me. I thought about them joining together and their love to make me, to create me, to bring me into this world. I saw myself floating inside my mother. I imagined her being pregnant with me. I thought about her carrying me inside her and all the nutrition and love and warmth that I got from being inside her. And then I started envisioning all the food and water and alcohol and drugs that I put into my body through my life. I thought about all the abuse I put my body through with soccer and weightlifting and staying up late at night and all the bad food I ate and then I saw my cancer cells growing in my bone marrow. And I saw the chemo that they gave me, the chemo poison that they gave me, that I took into my veins so I could live. But still, I picked my body. I was in that body. I didn't have a choice. And it was strange because it felt okay. My body felt okay. It was my body. It was mine. And it felt okay. And then it was like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to go on. And the entity said, yes, we should go on. So even though there was quite a bit more in the journey that day, I would like to interrupt my telling that part of the story and switch to talking about what happened in the integration sessions that followed this, and share with you what happened clinically over the next few months of treatment with us, and then, because I've kept in touch with him, what followed in his life. So during the integration sessions, and we had 6 of them because he had his dosing session first. We assumed it was. We turned out to be right. He worked with many aspects of his psilocybin experience and his history as they emerged in his journey. We talked at length about his homeschooling by his mother, and there were some very interesting ways that transference events happened between Robert and me, and between Robert and my co-therapist, that mapped onto transference to his experience of being homeschooled by his mother. But that's another story. So his homeschooling by his mother, his transition to public school, and his becoming so sick and having to be cared for by his mother, and so dependent upon her when he was gravely ill. So we didn't do a lot of interpretive work about this, but he told the story, this time with a great deal more feeling. And as we explored these themes over those 4 weeks, his body subjectivity came to match what was true on the observable physical plane. He began to feel healthy, and he experienced his body as one that was reliable and strong, and not cadaverous, and not on death's door. His haunting preoccupation with an experience of body frailty and illness began to abate. His fear, preoccupation, and intrusive thoughts about death began to fade. His panic attacks decreased, and intrusive images of his traumatizing days when he was desperately sick abated. He started a meditation practice, which previously had been frustrating to him for years after the cancer, because when he would meditate, when he would read scripture, when he would go to Bible study groups, he couldn't find his spiritual feelings. He did the behaviors that used to evoke spiritual feelings, but the feelings didn't come. So he began to study the Bhagavad Gita, just as he had studied the Bible in childhood. And the Bible was a pathway to spiritual connection for God. And he found that studying the Mahabharata rekindled his feelings for the sacred, for the mystical. This was a very precious recovery for him. Robert became increasingly aware of his ambivalence about his girlfriend, and he decided he wanted to go into a more intensive psychoanalytically oriented therapy following the termination of his work in the study. So I am fond of thinking that Robert's chemotherapy was an extraordinarily effective treatment for his cancerous blood cells, and his psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy was equally effective for the psychological trauma and loss of spiritual aliveness that were the consequences of his illness and treatment. I'd like to close my talk today with just a brief connection to an academic paper published by Peter Gasser and Katarina Kirschner. And if anybody has a picture of Katarina, please please send it to me. And Torsten Passy, a colleague and friend of mine, this paper, LSD-assisted therapy for anxiety associated with a life-threatening disease. And I'm just going to convey to you the possible mechanisms of action at a psychological level that they put forward. I want to emphasize, as they did, that this work used sensible and carefully supervised LSD dosing in conjunction with intensive psychotherapy. All of these patients were suffering from existential anxiety induced by a life-threatening illness. There were three possible mechanisms of action at a psychological level. One is a cognitive experience with astonishingly lucid thoughts and altered association, with many problems being seen from novel perspectives and relationships at many different levels being seen at once. The second is a psychodynamic experience characterized by emergence of material into consciousness that was previously excluded, symbolic portrayal of important conflicts, abreaction, catharsis, and very vivid memories from the past. The third, psychedelic peak experiences, including the loss of the usual sense of self and positive ego transcendence, transcendence of time and space, a sense of awe and reverence, and meaningful new insight, which of course is also part of part number 2. So Robert's journey creatively wove together some of the most difficult parts of his history. A shattered relationship with parents, with religion, with faith and God, a devastating loss of his sense of invincibility, a traumatic near-death experience due to cancer, leading to a disembodied sense of himself and a never-ending search for a lost body that, although it returned on the physical plane, it did not return in the psychological representation of the body that he was living with. He also experienced a love cure that came to him literally from the heavens above and from the human beings that had loved him throughout his life, that were experienced as radiating love to him through the stars. Robert had a death and rebirth story, and his rebirth story began with his parents' union, these interuterine fantasies of being carried by his mother and incorporating her, and then all the world taking it in. Food, drugs, family, love, all of this with a new deep acceptance of having a vulnerable body. He grieved the invulnerable, invincible body that he had as an adolescent, or that he experienced himself as having adolescent, but was able to feel himself having a healthy, vulnerable body that had been sick, but was now well, but not invulnerable. He had a spiritual guide who came to him, who was sent by God, but was also not God. And the entity had one message for him, which he was very easy to accept: be kind to people. So this next passage, I put in when I'm speaking to non-psychoanalysts, but I'm going to read it anyway. I want to emphasize strongly here, and this is very important, that it was not the psilocybin molecules alone that brought about this transformative process for Robert. This was not a pharmacological treatment. The therapeutic process was deeply embedded in Robert's history, his spiritual and family history, his cultural and religious history, and of course, very much in the ways that the two therapists worked with him and held these narratives that he shared with us. And I think that in some ways, the creation of his journey had something to do with the 3 preparatory sessions that we had with him, communicating with him and then back to us, a shared way of understanding his invulnerability before the illness, his spiritual depth of feeling, his pre-existing safety and security in that, the traumatic loss of that, and then this transformative dreamlike experience of gradually recovering it. And I think that his co-therapist and I and Robert all came together to understand this as a potential arc, in that it's how we understood the development of his PTSD. It's very much within our non-psychedelic traditional psychoanalytic or psychodynamic way of conceptualizing what was lost in his illness. So he was very active in his engagement with research study. He was a very enthusiastic participant, and he was readily engaged with it. I can share that as a result of this experience, he felt that the current therapy that he was in was not psychoanalytically oriented enough or not deep enough. And I helped him find an affordable psychoanalytic treatment that he was in for, I think, 5 or 6 years. And I helped him become a control case with a training analyst. I mean, with a candidate, an analyst in training at NYU postdoc. So how did psychedelic therapy help Robert? First, an experience of a highly charged life review. Second, a creative and recreated experience of an origin story with the family, parents, and the universe, and death and rebirth. An experience of profound aloneness and disembodiment, followed by repeated experiences of connection. An increase in emotional vividness of his traumatic memory or his death body, and the appearance of spiritual resources, the entity to come to him that came to him from some other place, some place of otherness that came to him. Also, there were very unusual associative patterns and creative problem solving and culturally coherent life lessons, that is, lessons that are culturally coherent for the world in which he and his therapists and his study live. And that is the golden rule: kindness and compassion for others. So that's the end of my talk. If you're interested in learning more about psychedelic therapy, the way that we do it at Fluence, this is our website, fluencetraining.com. I'm happy to get emails from anybody if you would like to write me, jrgus77@gmail.com. And that brings us to the end of the talk. Thanks very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Jeff. A really fascinating case. It seems so often that we hear from people that have gone through the psychedelic trials that rather than the end of their treatment journey, it's often just the beginning, and it certainly sounded like that with Robert. We're running a little bit over, so unfortunately I'm going to save the question in case we can have some extra time at the end. Hopefully you won't have to run off. Aidan, if you want to take Jeff's email, I can pass it on to you, and maybe you can ask him through there. I'm going to pass on to Jules Evans now. Jules is the director of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project, which researches post-psychedelic difficulties and what helps people cope with them. He has taught this research at organizations and events, including Synthesis, at Fluence, at ICPR, Breaking Convention, Clerkenwell Health, MAPS, and the Psychedelic Health Professionals Network. He is the editor of the Ecstatic Integration, a popular psychedelic substack. He's the author of and editor of 4 books, including Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations, and The Art of Losing Control. He's written and presented on mental health for organizations including the BBC, The Times, Aon, New Statesman, and his research has been covered by NBC, The Atlantic, and other media organizations. Jules is really one of the most accomplished and eminent voices in the field of critical psychedelic studies, I would say, and I'm really looking forward to his presentation. Thanks again, Jeff, and here's Jules.
Thank you, Timmy. Hello, everybody. Nice to see familiar faces here. And congratulations, Timmy, and all your team on the launch of this much needed clinic. I think I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. So yes, as Timmy said, I'm the director of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project. I'm also the editor of a Substack called Ecstatic Integration. I'm kind of journalist and a semi-academic and writer. I can start by talking about why I got into this topic of supporting people and finding out about what happens when people have difficult psychedelic experiences and extended difficulties after psychedelics. So I was very into psychedelics, particularly as a teenager in the UK in the 1990s. My most intense phase of psychedelic experimentation was 15 to 18. My friends and I went at it very hard, and we had lots of fun, some transcendent experiences. But then a few of us had difficult experiences, which really kind of left their mark on us. So when I was 18, I had a bad trip. No kind of attention to set and setting. This was like I took LSD at a rave and then went to an after party with people I didn't really know. And I got into a state of intense paranoia, self-consciousness, and fear. And I went to bed that night with this thought kind of buzzing in my brain. You've really done it this time. You've permanently broken yourself. You've broken your brain. That's actually quite a common belief among people who have post-psychedelic difficulties, by the way. I interviewed two therapists at Tomislav Magic's clinic in Berlin just this week. And they said that that's something they often hear from their clients as well, this fear of having permanently broken yourself and damaged your brain. Now, I thought I bounced back, and for a few weeks, I wasn't much the worse. But then at university, various symptoms emerged: panic attacks, nightmares, derealization, social anxiety, things that I had no terminology for at the time, but I felt like a completely different person. And I was extremely frightened and ashamed. I had no idea what was going on or who I was becoming. I dealt with this in the English way. I didn't talk to anyone about it for a few years. Not even my closest friends, who were the people I lived with, who were surprised years later when I wrote about it, because English people can go through all kinds of psychological turmoil without showing it at all to people on the outside. But finally, when I was 20, I went to a therapist, tried to explain what was going on. And this therapist said, "This sounds like teenage angst. Here are some beta blockers." And that was that. When I was 21, I went to a psychiatrist saying, "Look, I'm still really struggling." And this psychiatrist did diagnose me with PTSD and social anxiety. And he said, "Don't worry, I can cure you in 2 sessions using EMDR and EFT, emotional freedom techniques." I thought, how incredible. I've been suffering from this for 5 or 6 years, and this guy can clear it up in 2 sessions. Sadly, that wasn't true. And I really had to figure out for myself what was going on and how to get better. Eventually, when I was about 24, so after kind of 6 years of getting worse and worse, I found some things that helped. Cognitive behavioral therapy. I went to a CBT support group for people who suffer from social anxiety. There was no therapist present, but some of those ideas and practices did help me. And that got me into Stoicism, Stoic philosophy, which also helped me. But it took me many years to really recover to normal, happy functioning. In that time, I became a writer, a journalist, and eventually an academic. And I started publishing books. My first book was on Stoicism and how people use it today. And my second book, The Art of Losing Control, I was interested in ecstatic experiences, how we find them in Western culture. When are they good for us? When are they bad for us? And I became aware there was a real lack of ecstatic literacy in Western culture. And I think that affects people when they try psychedelics. Either there's an attitude of fear or ignorance towards the ecstatic, or there can be an over-attachment to ecstatic experiences, including to psychedelic experiences. They become the be-all and end-all, the meaning of life. I also became interested in messy ecstatic experiences, what Stanislav Grof called spiritual emergencies. And I co-edited a book of 14 people's accounts of their own spiritual emergencies, what they were like and what helped them through. That was called Breaking Open. And, you know, not everyone likes that frame of spiritual emergencies. For some people, it's too spiritual. So I think that's an important point just to make about respecting people's personal choice in how they frame their difficulties. Anyway, in 2021, at the height of the psychedelic renaissance, it was this very exciting time when ecstatic experiences were becoming more and more common, and there was beginning to be more of a kind of industry, an ecstatic experience economy, and a multi-billion-dollar psychedelic industry. But amid a lot of the hype that existed 3 years ago, I had some concerns. What about the risks of psychedelics? What about the risks of bad trips or of difficulties after trips? 3 years ago, there was very little research on psychedelic harms, on post-psychedelic difficulties, and there was very little evidence-based support for people who got into difficulties. So in September 2022, I, along with colleagues, launched the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project. We wanted to find out what sort of difficulties happen to people, and what, if anything, do they say helped them cope with those difficulties. So we began to produce research. Our first paper was a lead written by Anna Lutkachis at the University of Sydney, looking at short-term integration challenges after a psilocybin retreat. So in Anna's study, 30% of people who went to a psilocybin retreat in Holland reported short-term integration challenges. Things like increased emotional volatility, spiritual bypassing, or feeling disconnected from their home environment when they went back home. We then started a bigger survey, which we sent out, in which we asked people, have you ever experienced difficulties after psychedelics? If so, what sort of difficulties, and what, if anything, helped you to cope with these difficulties? We got 608 responses, all of whom were people who reported having difficulties after their psychedelic experience. 1/3 of this data set said their difficulties lasted longer than a year, and 1/5 said their difficulties lasted longer than 3 years. Now, we didn't look at the prevalence, like how common are these sorts of extended difficulties, but others have. So Otto Simonson at the Karolinska Institute did a survey of people who'd taken psychedelics in naturalistic settings. Of his survey, 9% said they experienced functional difficulties lasting longer than a day after taking psychedelics. So these kinds of extended difficulties are quite common. Now, in our survey, we asked, what sort of difficulties did you experience? And people could write a few words or as long as they wanted to describe their difficulties. And then we did a thematic analysis of all these 608 responses to sort them into 8 overarching categories: cognitive difficulties, emotional difficulties, social, spiritual, existential, somatic, behavioral, self-perception difficulties, and finally, psychosis was a kind of standalone category. And in those 8 overarching categories, we had 60 subcategories, many different types of categories, like fear of going back to the experience, fear of going to hell after you die if you had a kind of hell psychedelic experience. So all this kind of range of difficulties, but the most common were, first of all, anxiety, increased, just people feeling more anxious after a very difficult psychedelic experience. And then there were also kind of subtypes of anxiety, like the fear of going mad, the fear of being permanently damaged, feeling traumatized by the trip. The second most common category was visual distortions, kind of hallucination, persistent perception disorder. Another common category was derealization and depersonalization. A fifth was existential confusion. We actually published a follow-up paper on that, and we were influenced by Jeffrey's work on that. So people who just felt their meaning-making, their normal way of making sense of the world had been kind of ruptured or violated by their psychedelic experience, leaving them in a state of continued bewilderment about what model of reality to use for the world, or about how to make sense of their experience. And another very common type of extended difficulty was social disconnection, just feeling separated from the people around them who can understand this experience. We've just submitted a follow-up study on some of these extended difficulties, looking at the duration of them and the intensity of suffering involved. This was with a data set of just over 100 people. And in this follow-on study, existential confusion seemed to last the longest of all these types of extended difficulties, but paranoia caused the most reported suffering. And then we've also tried to find out, we've asked people what helped, if anything, to cope with these difficulties, what helped you to recover. And again, people gave all sorts of responses in terms of what helped them. So that's a very important point. There is no one size fits all in terms of what helps people recover from post-psychedelic difficulties. The most common coping method that people said was speaking to a friend or loved one. Some people said that seeing a therapist helped them to recover. A few talked about online support services like the Fireside Project or integration groups. And by the by, my project runs an online peer support group for people coping with post-psychedelic difficulties on the last Sunday of every month. It's actually meeting this Sunday if anyone's interested in joining. But people also mentioned a lot of self-care methods. Don't forget, we're in a landscape at the moment where there's very little specialist evidence-based support for people with post-psychedelic difficulties. So often people just have to find ways of coping on their own. People talked about meditation and prayer was the most popular coping technique of all, in terms of self-care methods. They talked about cognitive practices like compassionate self-talk or journaling. They talked about embodied practices like exercise or walking with nature, which was particularly helpful to feel grounded in their body if they felt derealized or depersonalized. And they also talked about finding helpful information. For example, just information about the, HPPD or other kinds of post-psychedelic difficulties. And by the by, there is very little information out there on these kinds of post-psychedelic difficulties. Now, again, just to go back to this point, it's not one size fits all. For example, some people said meditation was really helpful for them. For other people, meditation made their symptoms worse, particularly if they were experiencing acute derealization. Support from others or support from therapists was sometimes helpful, but not always. Sometimes people said they asked for support, but it actually wasn't helpful. Why would that be? Well, sometimes their friends or family or medical or spiritual experts could dismiss their difficulties or pathologize it or misdiagnose it, perhaps say they have psychosis when they've actually got HPPD. They could also over-spiritualize their difficulties. They would say, some people told us they went to a psychedelic integration coach, for example, and this coach was a bit of a devotee of the religion of psychedelics and tell them, well, you need to listen to the medicine. You're not listening to the medicine enough, or maybe you need to go and do more psychedelics. So just to conclude, if I was to give some takeaway points, I would say we're still learning about post-psychedelic difficulties. This is a very young research field. We're learning what sort of difficulties people experience, how common they are, and what helps people to recover from these difficulties. Now there is more research being done in the last 3 years. There's a lot of researchers now working on psychedelic harms, and we're beginning to kind of match up some results. For example, Tomislaw's team in Germany, Abigail Calder's team in Switzerland. Her team, for example, has just published a paper that found the most common type of post-psychedelic difficulty is sleep issues, things like nightmares and so on. But there's still also very little evidence-based research on what helps people recover. So we need to really be careful to pay attention and listen to the client. Don't make it worse by jumping in with your preferred theory or interpretation of their issues. Unfortunately, sometimes people come to my project with stories of therapists or support centers that made their problems worse because of how they responded to them in sessions. 2 clients complained to me about a therapist who works at a psychedelic support center. This therapist basically shamed them for doing the medicine wrong, and they came away from these sessions feeling worse. And I actually shared this with the founder of this support center, and to their credit, they took it very seriously. Others have come to me and said they went to see an IFS therapist who told them they had an entity within them. Again, some people might find that helpful, but these particular clients did not. So we're still learning. Go gently, be open, and listen. We're still learning about how many sessions are necessary to recover from post-psychedelic difficulties. It might be just one session that people just need reassurance that no, they're not alone, they haven't broken their brain. But it might involve many sessions. We're still learning. We're still learning what difficulties were caused by the trip, what might have been pre-existing difficulties. What are the predictors of post-psychedelic difficulties? What factors may genetics play? So I think it's important that this early stage in the field, we learn together, that we connect together with other clinics working on these kinds of difficulties, with research centers, to learn from each other. For example, I interviewed two therapists at Tomislav Majic's clinic in Berlin, who told me that they found anti-seizure medication helpful for people coping with HPPD. Well, that's useful information. I think at this early stage, it's important that we try not to be too theory-driven, but rather to pay attention to the individual client, to not be like the hammer who treats everyone like the same nail. And I think it's also important we keep track of outcomes through feedback, through surveys, to see what seems to work with specific kinds of difficulties and what may make it worse. No one wants to cause harm, but many healers unintentionally do because they are more wrapped up in their own status as healers and experts, or more wedded to their preferred modality, rather than listening to the individual in front of them. So just to conclude, I wish Timmy once again all success with this clinic. We need more of a psychedelic safety net to learn more about psychedelic harms and what may cause them, to communicate the risks more accurately, and to provide more evidence-based support. And I very much hope the Psychedelic Experience Clinic becomes an important part of this emerging safety net. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jules. Yeah, I think an important case made there for taking seriously the complaints of people that are suffering after psychedelic experiences. It's not all love and light. Bad trips can happen and should be taken seriously. Also, a case in there for the importance of an analytic stance and an ethic of listening and care. Thank you so much, Jules. I really appreciate it. We are quite tight for time, so if it's okay, if all three speakers, if possible, maybe we'll run a little bit over and answer some of the questions then. If not, I'll try and send them out to you afterwards. Now we'll hand over to Richard Boothby. I'm going to do a quick introduction for you too. Richard Boothby is Professor of Philosophy at Loyola University, Maryland, USA. He has a BA in Philosophy from Yale University and a Master's in Counseling and Consulting Psychology from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a PhD in Philosophy from Boston University. Boothby's research focus is oriented towards continental philosophy, with special attention to psychoanalytic theory in both Freud and Lacan. Richard's published a number of books. A personal favorite is Embracing the Void, which I personally think should be read in conjunction with Blown Away, Refinding Life After My Son's Suicide, which is incredibly moving. A difficult read, but very, very worth it. Thank you so much for joining us, Rick. You can take it away.
Oh, thanks for having me. I wasn't totally sure what I would have most useful to say to the group. And after hearing what's been said, I'm even more confused about that. But let me at least say that this whole problematic of both of therapeutics, but also of what possible role psychedelics can play with therapeutic action. I've been not only interested in it, but I've actually really, in a certain limited way, experienced it. So I'll say a few things about that and try to be brief, leaving as much time both for questions about what I may say, but also general discussion. I had in 2007, the really traumatic experience of losing my then 23-year-old son, my only child, to suicide. It was suicide in large measure in despair over a drug addiction that he just could not get a hold of, and he had in the meantime had developed a really morbid fascination with guns, so he had the ready tools to pull himself out of the world at a press of a trigger, and finally did take that option, leaving behind a 3.5-year-old little boy who I was just with over the weekend, who's now a senior about to graduate from college, a wonderful kid, actually. I just love him, and the woman with whom he had that boy. But I, then 53 years old, losing my son Oliver, now 17 years ago, was devastated and wondered if I would ever recover from it. And above all, I guess in keeping with my own personality, my own training, my own little bag of positive powers as a philosopher, I kept thinking to myself, wouldn't it be so wonderful to be able to get some handle on understanding what happened? How was this possible that I would not only raise a son with these problems, but that he would take the ultimate exit of suicide, and wanting to know, wanting to fill in the blank, wanting to somehow make sense was the overwhelming drive for me. And I re-entered. I'd been in psychoanalysis in various times in my life before this, partly for learning the craft and partly for working on my own soul. But I re-entered psychoanalysis and remained for 3.5 years, 4 times a week, in the aftermath of my son's death. And that was helpful. But about a year into that, I had the great fortune of getting a spot in the Johns Hopkins Behavioral Sciences program, working with psilocybin, the Roland Griffiths study that I had actually been planning to get. I was sort of scheduled to start with them when my son Oliver died. And I had to tell him, look, I can't do it right now. I'm just overwhelmed. But a year later, by a miracle, my spot was still sitting there. And I called them back and said, I'd like to do it now. And they said, you can, so, which was amazing to me. But the result was utterly surprising to me. We had 4 active sessions and 1 placebo session with enormous help from the staff. Mary Casamano, who was mentioned by Jeffrey, I think, and was one of them, and another one working with me to get ready for the experience. They really make a great deal of not only setting in the actual room where the drug will be administered and experienced, but also a whole series of very careful, very thoughtful and soulful preparations with me, with each of their participants, so that you really fleshed out a human relationship with the 2 people who are going to be kind of walking you through this thing, or sitting with you anyway during the hours that you're tripping. That was a huge part of it. But I was astonished at how rich and how transformative, really surprising to me. I went in quite skeptical, but I was absolutely blown away by how enriching and calming and basically enlarging and healing that uh, experience was. Since that time, I have only done psilocybin once since that time, rather minor uh, time, but I haven't felt the need or even the want to go back to it. I have some curiosity about it, but it hasn't been very driven. But it is interesting to me, and I'll just mainly focus on this, and then shut up and let questions come. The main thing that happened to me, I believe, in the course of this psilocybin kind of a treatment, for me anyway, was giving up my demand to know and having it replaced by a kind of acceptance of unknowing. That was a real surprise. It really came in from I don't know where, but it was a very, very powerful experience. And it was definitely part of the effect of the drug. It would take me all night, let alone the remainder of the little time I have right now, to say much at all illuminating about how exactly this unknowing, this wave of acceptance of unknowing kind of drew over me and carried me away. But it was extremely intense. And it's basically in the last 17 years of my life taken over my intellectual interests and become the real focus of my work. And both of the books that Timmy was talking about, this memoir about my son's suicide, Blown Away, and also these books are both of them only 2 years out. Embracing the Void, Rethinking the Origin of the Sacred. Both the books are very, very, very centrally concerned with what does it mean to accept unknowing. The religion book in particular um, takes unknowing as the kind of primal problem of the religious. How do we live in the midst of a general deficit of knowing? And of course, what part of the things that I do is show in world religions and the history of religion how faith and awe and religious feeling are primally rooted in the experience of unknowing, though religions, in my view, unfortunately, usually, replace that experience and that relationship with unknowing with something like rescue knowing, and in the ultimate case, dogma, as if one has to staunch the bleeding of our cognitive life as it spills out into unknowing and replace it with some kind of reassuring certainty and dependable knowing. Anyway, this has been now the fascination that's taken over my intellectual life. I'm working now and coming to the end of a book on Socrates, where I really take in a new rigor and a new enthusiasm, a new kind of emphasis on Socratic ignorance, about how profound this figure of the ancients was in insisting that it's more important to ask good questions than to have any particular answers. That the really crucial thing in the philosophical instinct is to be open to, yeah, what we don't know. How and why this kind of my own personal turning to unknowing, and I would even say it's now an intellectual project, but it's definitely become a kind of part of my character, almost a kind of the leitmotif of my whole kind of understanding of existence and of life. Certainly, it's at the heart of beauty, what Freud called sublimation is in some very great extent a kind of ecstatic unknowing, it seems to me. But I feel like I've been given this out of my son's death, and it's been my way of, yes, definitely getting some part of my relationship with him back. It took realizing how little I really knew, crucially, even though I had a closer relationship with him, I think, than I think than many fathers in particular have with their sons. We were extremely close. But I so little understood crucial things. And that wasn't simply a failure. That was a kind of, I think, the rule rather than the exception. We all, even in our most cherished relationships, know ultimately very little about what's going on. We live with it. We kind of dance with it. We laugh and cry with it. But we don't have the kind of understanding that I was demanding in the immediate aftermath of his death. And this, by the way, this little burst of talking to you is completely irrelevant to all the little notes that I made to work with you about. So I don't really know whether I've said much that's coherent or not, but I do feel like I was rescued. In this sense, I would have to say, if there is a great potential for the use of psilocybin and of other psychedelics in a therapeutic modality, I really have to say I was an enormously successful application of it. Really benefited from it. It was fantastically supportive and reinventing my whole sense of being alive. And with that, I think I'm gonna shut up. If people have questions, I'd be happy to talk some more, but thank you for inviting me, Timmy.
Thank you so much. It's really a very moving story, and you tell it with such eloquence as well. And I think that what you've said and what you've written speaks to how I try and work in the clinic, how I'm learning to work in the clinic, and how to think about psychedelics as well. You know, I've got only two busts on my desk. One is Freud and one is Socrates. And I hold that sort of ethic of questioning and non-imposition front and center. And I think it merges well with what Jules was saying as well. He's mentioned in the chat a paper that you might find interesting. Thank you so much for highlighting that. Maybe it's a good time to jump into some of these questions then. I'm going to start with one that was asked of Jeff, but I would also like to hear your thoughts on it too, Rick. But Jeff, if you would like to answer first. Sorry, let me just find it. So question for Jeff from Jack. Do you think that the phenomenology of psychedelic experiences can help inform debates within psychoanalysis? For example, the idea that the subject is necessarily alienated, fragmentary, lacking, or if there is a possibility for creating a unified self?
Well, there are 3 or 4 questions in that. Could you read it? And I'll try to answer each one at a time.
Sure.
First section.
Do you think that the phenomenology of psychedelic experiences can help inform debates within psychoanalysis?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the oldest tropes in the world that what the telescope did for the astronomer and what the microscope did for the biologist, when they were invented, they allowed not just to see more, but to know more, to imagine more, and to understand things that were wrong, and to discover things that you never even imagined before. So I think that psychoanalysis stands to enormously benefit from psychedelic phenomenology and understanding how the mind works, how change happens, and the nature of the numinous, the unknown, the unknowable, and the ineffable, all of which are somewhat frightening to many analysts, but I think psychedelics can give greater access to them and show how important perceiving them and being able to be present with them can be.
Thank you very much. And following on from that, Jack gives an example around this debate, or excuse me, two camps within psychoanalysis of the foundation of subjectivity being fragmentation, alienation, sort of lack at the heart of subjectivity and desire, or this idea of a movement towards wholeness, or maybe an originary wholeness. Do you think psychedelics have something to say in those debates?
Well, I'm going to ask to exclude the concept of lack from my answer because I don't feel settled in understanding the concepts of lack, and especially around Lacan in terms of speaking about psychedelics. But we are all alienated from ourselves. We are all alienated from parts of ourselves, whether it's through being in self states that don't communicate with one another well, or with whether we have more of a peeling the onion Freudian model of deeper and deeper into the unconscious. We're all alienated from ourselves, and at the same time, that's familiar. It's like stuff in the attic or this basement that you put there and you forgot it's there. It's there, it's yours, but you aren't aware of it. And so we're all alienated, and we all can come to know more, feel more, imagine more from what's inside of us. And there is a capacity for the numinous, for the infinite, for the mysterious that is within each of us, which some people cling to dogma or religion or TikToks in order to keep a distance from. And I think psychoanalysis and psychedelic therapy both privilege the idea that openness to the mystery and the unknown, especially the difficult to face unknown, is a path to greater integrity and wholeness. I don't think we're ever fully sort of integrated and connected until we're buried in worm food, and then the worms eat us, and then the birds eat the grass, and then they're singing. In a way, that kind of connection with all things is almost incomprehensible to us, little beings that move around the world as if we are all separate from each other.
Could I pose a question there to Jeffrey, and maybe also Jules might have something to say about this, but do you feel, Jeffrey, that I mean, my own experience was, and what I've read seems to reiterate it, that psilocybin, perhaps in particular, but many psychedelic drugs have the effect of delivering a very convincing sense of the interconnectedness of everything, the absolute kind of interwovenness of being. And for me, that was the main thing that gave me over to this question of, or this experience of unknowing, that those were the two sides of the same issue in a way, precisely because everything is, we experience it in the psilocybin experience, everything is absolutely one in a sense, yet we can't really understand how that could possibly be across all of these differences. So it becomes a kind of necessity to add, when one says everything is one, everything's a kind of a part of a whole, some cosmic whole. We have to actually, in the next breath, say, yes, and we don't really understand it, how it's all knit together. We just know, we feel it on the gut level that it is. Does that make sense to you in terms of?
Say better than that, but Jules, did you want to offer an answer?
Well, I mean, I haven't run psychedelic trials, so others would be able to answer better than me. I would just say that you definitely hear those kinds of people's experiences, but it's just there's a variety. It's unpredictable. So you get people who get a very strong sense of certainty about a particular noetic truth they've arrived at. And that could be all kinds of things. To, like, you know, be kind. That's a pretty benign kind of truth that people arrive at, but people cannot get anything from, you know, I mean, the person sitting next to me at an ayahuasca ceremony became convinced that entities had told her the universe was about to disappear and she was about to ascend to the 5th dimension. And she was terrified by this prospect because it meant the disappearance of everyone she loved. So this is one of the challenges for psychedelics and for psychedelic therapy is the unpredictability of the responses.
I'd like to offer a brief answer, a different kind of answer to your question, Rick. And this is one that comes out of a practical psychoanalytic approach. And it's a theory that I like. So I'm not saying it's a gospel, but we begin in the ultimate in connection, which is existing inside of our mother or a human being that develops us. And we are not even aware of how connected we are to the entire universe around us. Then we're born and we begin to separate. And the price we separation is loss of connection. And we develop defenses and a personality and grown-up skills and cognitive skills in order to cope with that separation, in order to achieve separation and individuation. And there is a longing, I think, as people get older, to discover a different kind of reconnection through spirituality or other kinds of work, not a regressive to a primal infantile level, but an awareness of where we're going, which is ultimately going back into connection to all things, where we don't know where we came from and we don't know where we're going after we're here. And the idea that we can let go of our defenses and keep us separate and individuated from people for a while and see more and know more and learn more and feel more and imagine more, and then come back together and talk about it with a trusted person is a theory of how psychedelic therapy works in a psychoanalytic model that I find really useful in the ketamine work that I do and that I find useful in supervision that I do of clinicians. Larry Fishman has written a beautiful paper about this called Seeing Without Self, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Really a great, great paper.
Thank you very much. Tomislav, did you want to chime in?
Yes, I was just thinking about this idea of connectedness and psychedelics making or increasing feelings of connectedness, or sometimes maybe inducing them or making them possible, like everything is interconnected. I think this is a very special and a very precious part of psychedelic experiences. On the other hand, many of the post-acute complications associated with psychedelics consist in derealization, as we have heard from Jules, psychosis, psychotic symptoms after psychedelics, also panic, and other types of psychedelic-related problems are associated with disconnectedness, not feeling connected to the environment, to one's loved ones, to one's emotions, to all those kind of things. And this is especially tragic for people who are using psychedelics in order to feel more connected. And they say they're so disappointed but now because they feel more disconnected than ever. So this is the other part of the medal. And it's really not predictable in a certain way how I think this is by far the smaller group of people. Most people experience connectedness, of course, but there's this small part of people who also do not get there. And so this is, I think, really important to address. And maybe there's also some kind of association with psychosis, as in psychosis, there's also feeling of like the barriers, the ego barriers are loose, and it's difficult to separate for what is mine and what is the others. And this is experienced in a very threatening way. And so there's this association with psychedelics, I think. And some even psychotic people have also mystical experiences. So this is really important to have the differential diagnosis also for treating people with post-acute psychedelic difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting because, you know, going back to the initial question, we have these sort of two models, and in fact, they're kind of represented in the speakers that we have today. You know, Jeff with a sort of Anglo-American psychoanalytic perspective, where there's seemingly much more of a sort of mystical trend and a kind of assertion of a kind of connectedness and that kind of thing. And then Rick with a more sort of Lacanian angle on things within theory, of, you know, this lack at the heart of subjectivity, this ultimate sort of alienation, disconnection that can't be ever really overcome, and thinking clinically about taking these two stances within the clinic and how that could be, you know, complicated when we are thinking about the psychedelic clinic, is an area of research that I really think needs fleshing out and could be very fruitful. For example, you know, uh, if we take the Lacanian clinic, should we actually be trying to help people come to terms with an ultimate disconnection and an alienation? Um, it's just one thought. I wanted to ask one of these questions that actually came through for Ian, if we've still got you here.
Yeah, still
So
here.
the question is from Joe Kibble, and he says, as far as you know, are there any key differences between the peer support group offered by Saipan and some of the others mentioned, like ASA, the Maudsley Integration Group, and the work that we're going to be doing with the sort of one-on-one psychotherapy at the Psychedelic Experience Clinic?
Yeah, I think there are many differences, but the key difference is that the peer support groups that we'll be providing are solely for former clinical trial participants. The pilot will just be made up of former trial participants who've completed the trial within the past 12 months. So there's just 20 people are going to be able to join that pilot at the moment, but it's completely open to anyone that's been treated on any psychedelic assisted therapy trial. There are other key differences as well. ASA is more of a program and a model, so you have a different focus every month. It's not peer support as such, although there is a huge community attached to that. The Maudsley, again, it's open to everyone rather than specifically clinical trial participants, although they do have a large number of clinical trial participants in the group, an increasing number. But when we were looking to set up peer support groups, it was driven by the fact people kept coming up to us after we'd spoken at events or emailing us or whatever, saying, you know, finally someone who understands what I've been through. Now, you can kind of, and they were former clinical trial participants, so you can kind of say that there are commonalities between people that have experienced psychedelics in different settings. And for many people, many trial participants, it's absolutely fine. You know, the Maudsley is a fantastic, I was a part of that myself, fantastic group. You know, ASA will also really, you know, that will be home for other people that really benefit from that and benefit from focusing on nature connection, connection to others, connection to self. But we found quite often there was a real need for it to be purely clinical trial and treatment participants coming together, because there are several unique aspects to that experience that aren't experienced in other places where you would take psychedelics. So it's not really what we're providing, we hope, is just another strand of that ecosystem that will be right for some people. Other people will be fine being in a room full of experienced psychonauts, for instance. You know, that will be, the commonalities will be enough for them to get enough from that. But I think with clinical trial participants, a key difference is that many of them go through the trial experience and come out the other end, and they may well be psychedelic naive. They may have never experienced psychedelics before. They don't have that attached community around them, maybe psychedelic community. And while yes, it's possible to connect to that afterwards, some people don't feel comfortable in that environment. They don't feel that the experience quite overlaps enough, maybe. Yeah, so it's really just another strand, another form of support that hopefully will be beneficial to some people, you know. So that's why we're setting up the peer support groups solely for clinical trial participants. It will be fully peer-to-peer as well. So facilitators will also have lived experience. They will also share during the groups. So it's going to be hopefully a collaborative effort throughout. It will evolve with input from the peers within those groups as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We have reached time. So Jules has to go. I just want to say thank you so much, Jules. I'm gonna ask one more question, if it's okay for Jeffrey, if you've got time. Do you have a minute? Thank you so much. And thank you, Jules. It kind of leads on from what Ian was saying. The question is, you alluded to the standardization of psychedelic research, and I wonder, do you think this could be problematic? How do you feel about the current trajectory of psychedelic research?
Well, I'll begin by saying I am no longer involved with randomized clinical trial psychedelic research. I became increasingly disenchanted and then or simultaneously alarmed at what I experienced as the cruelty and unethical nature of placebo-controlled studies. I understand their scientific purpose, but I found teaching therapists to do placebo sessions and the whole monkey business around placebos is really problematic, unethical, and cruel and unusual. I don't like it. So I understand some people, it's a certain kind of standard. So that concerns me. Also, research involves standardizing a therapy so that all the participants receive the same therapy. And it is impossible to do that. And in some ways, it's the exact opposite of the psychoanalytic model, in which a unique relationship develops between the patient and the analyst. And so having the exact number of sessions the same, having the music the same, having the context the same, I think are research constrictions that prevent psychedelic therapy from developing in an organic, natural way, and in a way that's best for the patient rather than for the data. Research is organized around generating reliable data, and it is not most interested in uniquely enhancing the best effect or the best outcome for each particular person that's involved. And those are contradictory goals. I think the uniformity of it and the uniqueness of it are certainly work against one another.
Thank you so much. I really couldn't agree more. And, you know, as much as I love the progress of science and, you know, the accumulation of more data and information, I think that, yeah, there's a real ethical issue there. And, you know, with my other hat on, this is where the importance of informed policy comes in, and thinking about how we can best facilitate the rollout of these medicines post-market authorization to make sure that both people can get access, but the therapists are able to practice and develop the theory in the ways that seems best to them. Sort of too quick constriction of how this therapy can be done could be harmful to the collection of data too. And it's just something that we should bear in mind. Yeah, we have come to time. I just want to thank everybody for coming and for buying tickets and donating. Donations are still open through the Why Donate page, and we'll be very grateful to receive any of them. I'm super grateful to Ian, Jeff, Rick, and Jules. And yeah, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic event, and I hope to run into you all soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.